The inner battlefield, how the flesh fights God's work in you. There is a war that most people never fully recognize, yet it determines the direction of their entire life. It does not take place in governments, economies, or cultures. It does not require armies or weapons. It happens quietly, relentlessly inside the human soul. Scripture calls it the battle between the flesh and the spirit. This inner battlefield is where destinies are shaped, faith is tested, and God's work is either strengthened or resisted. Many believers assume that once they come to God, the struggle ends. They believe faith should silence conflict, obedience should remove temptation, and spiritual maturity should bring peace without resistance. But the opposite is often true. The moment God begins his work in you, resistance intensifies. The flesh does not retreat quietly, it fights back. The flesh is not merely the body, it is the old nature that resists surrender. It is the part of you that craves control, comfort, validation, and immediate satisfaction. It is the voice that whispers compromise when God calls for obedience. It is the subtle force that makes delay seem reasonable, disobedience seem harmless, and spiritual discipline feel unnecessary. The flesh does not hate religion, it hates transformation. It does not fear belief, it fears surrender. God's work in a person is never superficial. He does not simply want to improve behavior. He intends to reshape identity. He does not aim to decorate the old self. He seeks to crucify it and raise something new. This is why the flesh reacts so violently. When God moves deeper, the flesh feels threatened. When the Spirit leads toward holiness, the flesh tightens its grip. When God calls you higher, the flesh fights harder. This battle explains why many believers feel divided within themselves. They love God, yet struggle to obey Him. They desire spiritual growth, yet resist spiritual discipline. They want freedom, yet cling to habits that enslave them. This contradiction is not hypocrisy, it is warfare. And ignoring this war does not make it disappear. It only allows the flesh to gain ground quietly. Understanding this inner battlefield is essential. Without clarity, believers misinterpret their struggles. They assume something is wrong with their faith, when in reality, something is right. The conflict itself is evidence that God is at work. Dead things do not fight. Only living souls experience resistance. Only hearts being transformed feel tension. Only people being pulled upward feel the weight of what is trying to hold them down. This series is not meant to comfort the flesh. It is meant to expose it. It is not designed to make spiritual warfare sound poetic. It is meant to make it clear. If you want to understand why obedience feels costly, why surrender feels painful, and why growth often comes through pressure, you must understand the nature of this internal war. Everything God wants to build in you will be contested by what you once were. The inner battlefield is not something you can escape, but it is something you can win. The flesh recognizes God's work before you do. One of the most overlooked truths in the spiritual life is this: the flesh often recognizes God's activity before the conscious mind does. Long before you can explain what is happening, the flesh senses a threat. It reacts instinctively, not with logic, but with resistance. This is why inner turmoil often increases right before spiritual breakthroughs. The flesh feels exposed when God draws near. When God begins working in you, the first changes are rarely external. They happen in desire, conviction, and awareness. You start to feel uncomfortable with things that once felt normal. Conversations feel empty. Habits lose their pleasure. Certain environments suddenly feel heavy. This discomfort is not random. It is the spirit disturbing what the flesh depends on. The flesh thrives on familiarity. It survives by routine. Even destructive patterns feel safe when they are known. God's work threatens this stability. When He calls you to change direction, the flesh responds with fear disguised as logic. It tells you it is not the right time. It convinces you that growth can wait. It argues that moderation is enough, that sacrifice is extreme. that discipline is unnecessary. This is not rebellion in obvious form. It is resistance in subtle language. The flesh does not usually say, "Do not follow God." Instead, it says, "Follow him later." It does not say, "Disobey." It says, "Compromise just this once." It does not say, "Reject holiness." It says, "You deserve rest first." These arguments feel reasonable because they appeal to comfort rather than truth. Whenever God begins pruning something in your life, the flesh immediately reframes the pruning as loss instead of preparation. It convinces you that letting go means suffering rather than freedom. This is why believers often mourn what God is removing more than they celebrate what he is building. The flesh grieves the loss of control even when that control was destroying you. The flesh also reacts strongly to exposure. God's work always brings light, and light reveals inconsistencies. As conviction increases, the flesh becomes defensive. This defensiveness may appear as irritation, spiritual fatigue, or sudden doubt. You may begin questioning teachings you once embraced or resisting disciplines you once practiced. This is not because truth changed. It is because the flesh feels cornered. Spiritual disciplines threaten the flesh because they weaken its influence. Prayer reduces self-reliance, fasting disrupts comfort, silence removes distraction, obedience strips excuses. The flesh understands that if these practices continue, its authority will collapse. So it fights early, hoping to stop momentum before transformation becomes irreversible. This explains why many believers feel most tempted when they are most sincere. When you decide to pray consistently, distractions multiply. When you commit to obedience, opportunities for compromise increase. When you pursue purity, old desires resurface. This is not coincidence. The flesh recognizes that its time is limited. The tragedy is that many believers misinterpret this resistance as failure. They assume struggle means weakness. In reality, struggle often means progress. The flesh does not fight what it already owns. It fights what it is losing. The intensity of the battle is often proportional to the depth of God's work. Understanding this truth changes how you respond to inner conflict. Instead of retreating, you become alert. Instead of condemning yourself, you become discerning. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is God changing in me?" This shift is crucial. Without it, the flesh uses guilt to regain control. God does not expose the flesh to shame you. He exposes it to free you. Every uncomfortable conviction is an invitation to growth. Every internal resistance is an opportunity to choose alignment with the Spirit. But these moments require courage. It is easier to numb discomfort than to confront it. It is easier to distract than to surrender. The flesh depends on avoidance. The Spirit calls for engagement. The inner battlefield is not won by denying the conflict exists. It is won by recognizing its nature. When you understand that resistance is a sign of transformation, you stop running from the fight. You stop negotiating with the flesh. You stop expecting comfort where God is calling for change. God's work in you is intentional. It is precise, and it is unstoppable if you cooperate with it. The flesh may recognize this before you do, but recognition does not mean victory. It simply means the battle has begun. And this is only the beginning. If this message is speaking to you and you want to continue understanding this spiritual battle at a deeper level, subscribe to the channel now. This journey is not about motivation. It is about transformation. Stay connected so you don't fight this war alone. The flesh does not fight God in obvious ways most of the time. Its most effective weapon is not rebellion, but imitation. It learns the language of spirituality and uses it to protect itself. This is why many believers remain spiritually active, yet inwardly unchanged. The flesh adapts to religious environments without ever surrendering control. It attends worship, listens to sermons, quotes scripture, and even performs acts of service, all while quietly resisting the deepest work of God. One of the greatest deceptions in the inner battlefield is the illusion of spiritual progress without inner death. The flesh prefers improvement over transformation. It is willing to adjust behavior as long as identity remains untouched. It allows discipline as long as dependence is not required. It tolerates belief as long as obedience does not demand sacrifice. This is why the flesh is comfortable with religion but hostile toward intimacy with God. True spiritual transformation always threatens the flesh because it removes autonomy. God's work is not centered on making you more effective. It is centered on making you surrendered. The flesh resists this because surrender feels like annihilation. To the flesh, yielding control is not trust. It is extinction. This is why it reacts so strongly when God begins asking for deeper obedience, not just outward conformity. The flesh is especially skilled at delaying obedience. It convinces believers that timing matters more than faithfulness. It says things like, "I will obey when life is calmer," or "I need more understanding before I commit," or "God knows my heart, He understands." These statements sound humble, but they often mask fear. The flesh fears immediacy. God's call is almost always present tense. The flesh prefers indefinite future obedience because it never has to follow through. Another tactic of the flesh is emotional manipulation. It equates discomfort with danger and peace with approval. If obedience feels costly, the flesh labels it unhealthy. If surrender causes grief, the flesh calls it imbalance. If conviction brings sorrow, the flesh interprets it as condemnation. In this way, the flesh trains believers to trust feelings over truth, but God's work often disrupts emotional comfort before it establishes spiritual peace. The flesh also resists God by promoting self-reliance under the disguise of maturity. It convinces believers that needing God less is a sign of growth. In reality, spiritual maturity increases dependence, not independence. The more God reveals, the more aware you become of your limitations. The flesh hates this awareness because it thrives on illusion. It wants to believe it is capable, sufficient, and in control. This is why prayer becomes difficult when God is doing deep work. Not because prayer is ineffective, but because prayer dismantles self-sufficiency. In prayer, the flesh is silent. It cannot perform. It cannot impress. It cannot control outcomes. Prayer exposes weakness, and the flesh avoids anything that reminds it of its fragility. God's work also confronts the flesh through truth that demands decision, not just reflection. There is a difference between learning truth and submitting to it. The flesh enjoys learning because knowledge can be possessed without being obeyed. It enjoys discussions, debates, and interpretations because they create distance between truth and action. God, however, speaks truth to provoke response. When response is delayed, the flesh gains time to negotiate. The flesh negotiates constantly. It bargains with God internally. It offers partial obedience in exchange for preserved comfort. It agrees to give up some things in order to keep others. It seeks balance where God calls for surrender. This is why Jesus spoke so often about counting the cost. Not because discipleship is harsh, but because the flesh underestimates what obedience requires. Another way the flesh resists God's work is through distraction. It keeps the mind busy to avoid the heart being confronted. Noise becomes a refuge. Activity becomes a shield. Even good things can become distractions if they prevent stillness. God often speaks in silence, and the flesh avoids silence because silence removes escape routes. When God draws you into solitude, reflection, or waiting, the flesh becomes restless. It urges you to do something, anything, just to avoid stillness. This is because stillness allows truth to surface. In quiet moments, motives are exposed, attachments are revealed, loyalties are tested. The flesh prefers motion over revelation. The flesh also resists God by clinging to identity rooted in the past. It reminds you of who you were, what you did, what you lost, and what you fear becoming again. It uses memory as a weapon, not to heal, but to anchor you to old narratives. God's work, however, is future-oriented. He calls you forward, not backward. He speaks identity before behavior changes. The flesh resists this because it prefers familiar labels over unknown callings. One of the most painful moments in the inner battlefield occurs when God begins separating you from environments, relationships, or patterns that reinforce the flesh. This separation feels like loss, even when it is protection. The flesh interprets distance as abandonment. God sees it as alignment. This misunderstanding creates emotional resistance that can feel overwhelming. The flesh often disguises fear as loyalty. It tells you that staying where you are is faithfulness. Even when God is calling you to move, it equates change with betrayal. But obedience to God sometimes requires leaving what is comfortable, familiar, or socially affirmed. The flesh fights these moments intensely because they mark irreversible transition. God's work also exposes the flesh by redefining success. The flesh measures success by visibility, affirmation, and outcome. God measures success by faithfulness, obedience, and alignment. When God leads you into seasons where progress is invisible and results are delayed, the flesh becomes anxious. It demands proof. It wants evidence. It struggles to trust processes that do not feed ego. This is why many believers abandon obedience prematurely, not because God failed, but because the flesh grew impatient. God often works slowly to ensure depth. The flesh wants speed to maintain control. Waiting weakens the flesh because it cannot manipulate timing. In waiting, trust replaces strategy. Understanding these dynamics reveals a sobering truth. The flesh does not need sin to survive. It can survive on comfort, control, and religious routine. This is why superficial spirituality feels safe, but transformative faith feels dangerous. God's work is not to make you religious, it is to make you free. And freedom always threatens what once ruled you. The inner battlefield intensifies not when you fall, but when you rise. When God entrusts you with deeper insight, greater responsibility, or clearer calling, the flesh escalates its resistance. It knows that obedience at this stage will reshape everything. This is why temptation often increases after spiritual clarity. The flesh fights hardest when defeat is near. Victory in this battle does not come from suppressing the flesh through willpower. It comes from starving it through surrender. The flesh loses strength when it is no longer fed by attention, indulgence, or fear. It weakens when obedience becomes habitual and trust replaces control. God does not ask you to defeat the flesh alone. He asks you to walk in the Spirit. The Spirit does not negotiate. He leads. When followed consistently, the flesh loses authority, not instantly but progressively. This is the process of sanctification. It is slow, demanding, and deeply personal. The inner battlefield is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that God is doing something real. The flesh fights God's work because God's work is effective. And the more you understand this, the less power resistance has over you. If you want to continue this journey and go deeper into understanding how to overcome this inner war, subscribe to the channel now. What God is building in you deserves protection, clarity, and perseverance. Stay connected so you don't stop halfway through the transformation. The flesh does not simply resist God's work through temptation or compromise. It resists by shaping how you interpret reality. One of its most dangerous strategies is distortion. It reframes spiritual experiences in ways that protect its influence. It teaches you to interpret conviction as condemnation, discipline as legalism, obedience as extremism, and surrender as loss of self. In doing so, the flesh does not need to openly oppose God. It only needs to confuse your understanding of him. This distortion begins internally, in the way thoughts are formed and conclusions are drawn. The flesh is deeply invested in controlling interpretation because interpretation determines response. Two people can experience the same conviction. One repents and grows, the other withdraws and hardens. The difference is not the Spirit's voice, but how the flesh filters it. When the flesh dominates interpretation, even divine guidance feels threatening. God's work often brings clarity, but clarity requires honesty. The flesh fears honesty because honesty removes excuses. When God reveals truth about motives, attachments, or priorities, the flesh immediately reframes that revelation as accusation. It tells you that God is displeased, distant, or disappointed. This is one of the most damaging lies in the inner battlefield because it turns intimacy into fear. In reality, conviction is evidence of closeness, not rejection. God does not correct what he has abandoned. He does not discipline what he does not love, but the flesh cannot accept this because if conviction is love, then resistance becomes rebellion. So the flesh rebrands conviction as shame, hoping you will retreat instead of respond. This distortion also affects how believers view spiritual struggle. The flesh teaches that struggle means failure. It convinces you that if God were truly working in you, the battle would be easier. This belief leads many believers to hide their struggles rather than confront them. They perform strength while privately weakening. God's work thrives in honesty, but the flesh thrives in secrecy. Secrecy is one of the flesh's strongest allies. When struggles remain hidden, they remain powerful. The flesh convinces believers that admitting weakness will diminish their faith, when in fact it strengthens it. Scripture repeatedly shows that God's power is revealed through acknowledged weakness, not denied vulnerability. But the flesh resists this truth because vulnerability dismantles pride. Another distortion the flesh promotes is the idea that growth should feel natural and effortless. It tells believers that if something is from God, it should flow easily. When effort is required, the flesh assumes something is wrong. This is a misunderstanding of transformation. Growth often requires resistance, repetition, and discipline. Muscles do not strengthen without tension, neither does faith. The flesh resists effort because effort implies intentionality. Intentionality disrupts autopilot living. God's work demands attention, presence, and choice. The flesh prefers habits over decisions. It wants life to run on instinct, not obedience. This is why spiritual disciplines feel unnatural at first. They interrupt patterns the flesh relies on. God often leads believers into seasons where emotions do not align with obedience. You may feel dry while remaining faithful, tired while continuing to serve, uncertain while still trusting. These seasons expose whether faith is rooted in feeling or commitment. The flesh hates these moments because it loses leverage. When obedience continues without emotional reward, the flesh weakens. The flesh also distorts the concept of freedom. It equates freedom with indulgence and restraint with oppression. God defines freedom as alignment with truth. The flesh defines freedom as absence of limits. This is why surrender feels restrictive at first. The flesh interprets boundaries as threats rather than protection. In God's design, boundaries create space for life. In the flesh's narrative, boundaries create confinement. This distortion causes believers to resist commands that would ultimately heal them. They fear losing pleasure without realizing they are losing chains. The flesh clings to familiar captivity because it knows how to survive there. Another area where the flesh distorts perception is identity. God speaks identity before behavior changes. He calls people righteous while they are still being refined. The flesh rejects this because it relies on performance-based identity. It wants worth to be earned, not given. This leads believers to either strive endlessly or give up entirely. When identity is rooted in grace, obedience flows from gratitude. When identity is rooted in performance, obedience becomes exhausting. The flesh prefers exhaustion because exhaustion weakens discernment. Tired believers are more likely to compromise. Overburdened believers are more likely to retreat. God's work seeks rest for the soul, but the flesh keeps believers busy proving themselves. The flesh also distorts spiritual authority. It convinces believers that surrendering to God means losing themselves. In truth, surrender reveals the self God intended. The flesh fears this because its identity is built on false autonomy. It believes control equals existence. God's work dismantles this illusion gently but firmly. One of the most subtle distortions is how the flesh interprets waiting. Waiting is one of God's primary tools for formation. In waiting, trust is developed, patience is refined, and motives are purified. The flesh interprets waiting as stagnation. It becomes restless, frustrated, and doubtful. It urges action, even when God calls for stillness. This restlessness leads to premature decisions. The flesh would rather act incorrectly than wait obediently. It fears silence because silence reveals dependence. In waiting, strategies fade and trust becomes visible. The flesh cannot manipulate outcomes during waiting, so it resists it intensely. God's work also involves repetition. Lessons are often learned multiple times, not because God is ineffective, but because depth requires reinforcement. The flesh becomes impatient with repetition. It wants novelty, not mastery. It confuses familiarity with completion. But spiritual maturity is not about exposure. It is about embodiment. The flesh also distorts how believers view correction from others. God often uses people to reveal blind spots. The flesh interprets correction as attack rather than care. It becomes defensive, not discerning. This defensiveness protects pride but blocks growth. God's work flourishes in humility, but humility threatens the flesh's self-image. Another dangerous distortion is comparison. The flesh constantly compares journeys, progress, and outcomes. It measures spiritual worth against others. This leads to either pride or discouragement, both of which distract from obedience. God's work is personal. Comparison turns calling into competition. The flesh also distorts the concept of rest. God's rest restores strength and clarity. The flesh's rest avoids responsibility. It seeks escape rather than renewal. This leads to cycles of burnout followed by indulgence. God calls for rhythms of rest that sustain obedience. The flesh prefers extremes because extremes prevent consistency. Consistency is the flesh's enemy. Consistent obedience slowly dismantles its influence. Dramatic moments may inspire, but daily faithfulness transforms. The flesh resists consistency because it cannot negotiate with habit. Once obedience becomes routine, resistance loses power. God's work is often quiet. The flesh prefers noise. It wants visible confirmation, emotional intensity, and immediate results. Quiet obedience feels insignificant to the flesh, but it is powerful in the spirit. Seeds grow underground long before they break the surface. The flesh also distorts suffering. God uses suffering to refine, redirect, and reveal. The flesh sees suffering as punishment or failure. This leads believers to avoid discomfort at all costs. But avoidance delays growth. God does not waste pain. The flesh does not want you to believe that. Understanding these distortions is crucial, because victory in the inner battlefield depends on clarity. When you recognize how the flesh manipulates perception, you stop trusting its conclusions. You begin testing thoughts instead of obeying them automatically. You learn to separate feeling from truth, reaction from revelation. The flesh loses power when exposed. It thrives in confusion, but weakens in clarity. God's work brings clarity not to condemn, but to liberate. Every distortion revealed is an invitation to alignment. Every lie exposed is an opportunity for truth to reign. This inner battlefield is not about perfection. it is about direction. When the Spirit leads, even slow progress moves forward. When the flesh leads, even activity moves backward. Discernment is not about eliminating struggle, it is about choosing leadership. God's work in you is steady, patient, and intentional. The flesh is urgent, reactive, and fearful. Learning to recognize the difference changes everything. You stop mistaking resistance for wisdom. You stop interpreting discomfort as danger. You stop surrendering to voices that oppose transformation. And this awareness prepares you for deeper levels of freedom. If you want to continue this journey and fully understand how to overcome the flesh's influence and walk in lasting spiritual clarity, subscribe to the channel now. What God is forming in you deserves commitment, patience, and truth. Stay connected and continue this path of transformation. The flesh fights God's work most aggressively when obedience begins to cost something real. As long as faith remains theoretical, the flesh can coexist with it. As long as obedience does not disrupt routines, relationships, ambitions, or comforts, the flesh remains relatively calm. But the moment God's call touches what the flesh depends on for security, identity, or pleasure, resistance intensifies. This is the stage where many believers misunderstand what is happening and retreat, thinking they are losing something precious, when in fact they are being freed. Cost is the dividing line between admiration and discipleship. Many people admire God's truth. Few are willing to reorganize their lives around it. The flesh is comfortable with inspiration, but hostile toward reorientation. God's work always requires reordering priorities. He does not merely add himself to your life. He reshapes the structure of it. This restructuring threatens the flesh because it dismantles hierarchy. What once ruled must now submit. The flesh reacts strongly when obedience begins to affect daily decisions. When choices must be filtered through prayer rather than preference, the flesh feels restricted. When habits must be examined rather than indulged, the flesh feels exposed. When relationships must be evaluated rather than preserved at all costs, the flesh feels insecure. These reactions often manifest as fatigue, confusion, or internal resistance that feels disproportionate to the situation. This is because the flesh is not reacting to the decision itself, but to what the decision represents. Obedience represents loss of control. It represents submission to a will greater than your own. It represents trust in outcomes you cannot manage. The flesh fears this, not because obedience is harmful, but because obedience ends negotiation. God's work moves believers from selective obedience to comprehensive surrender. Selective obedience allows the flesh to remain in charge of certain areas. Comprehensive surrender leaves no safe zones. This transition is deeply uncomfortable. The flesh responds by magnifying the perceived cost. It exaggerates what you will lose while minimizing what you will gain. This exaggeration creates emotional pressure. The flesh tells you that obedience will isolate you, limit you, or diminish you. It convinces you that following God fully will make life smaller. In reality, obedience expands capacity. But expansion requires stretching, and stretching feels like strain before it feels like strength. One of the clearest signs that God's work is advancing is when obedience begins to require sacrifice rather than convenience. Convenience is neutral to the flesh. Sacrifice is hostile. When obedience costs comfort, time, reputation, or control, the flesh begins negotiating aggressively. It searches for alternatives that preserve appearance of faith without requiring surrender. This negotiation often sounds spiritual. The flesh says things like, God wouldn't want you to suffer, or balance is important, or you can still serve God without going that far. And these statements are not always false in isolation, but they are often used to avoid obedience. The flesh reframes sacrifice as extremism and compromise as wisdom. God's work also challenges the flesh by redefining what it means to win. The flesh defines victory as gain without loss. God defines victory as obedience regardless of outcome. This difference creates tension. When obedience leads to misunderstanding, delay, or apparent failure, the flesh questions God's wisdom. It demands explanation. It wants reassurance that the cost is worth it. God rarely provides reassurance in the form the flesh desires. Instead, he provides presence. He asks for trust, not proof. This is where many believers struggle. The flesh is willing to obey if outcomes are guaranteed. God calls for obedience before outcomes are visible. This requirement exposes whether faith is transactional or relational. Transactional faith obeys for results. Relational faith obeys because of trust. The flesh prefers transactions. It wants clear exchanges. God offers covenant. Covenant requires faithfulness without immediate reward. As obedience deepens, God often removes external supports that once made faith feel easy. This is not abandonment, it is maturation. He teaches believers to walk without leaning on constant affirmation, emotional highs, or external validation. The flesh interprets this removal as loss. God sees it as strengthening. This is why some seasons feel spiritually dry right when obedience is increasing. God is not withdrawing. He's teaching dependence beyond feeling. The flesh resists this intensely because it cannot survive without emotional reinforcement. It prefers excitement to endurance. Obedience also brings confrontation with fear. The flesh thrives on fear because fear preserves control. Fear discourages risk, limits obedience, and justifies retreat. God's work consistently calls believers through fear, not around it. Courage is not absence of fear, it is obedience in spite of it. When God asks you to speak truth, forgive deeply, let go, wait, or step forward without clarity, fear surfaces. The flesh magnifies consequences. It imagines worst-case scenarios. It rehearses loss. God does not always silence these fears. He asks you to walk through them. This is where trust becomes embodied rather than theoretical. Walking through fear weakens the flesh because fear loses authority when it no longer dictates behavior. Each act of obedience, despite fear, retrains the soul. Over time, courage becomes habit, and fear loses influence. The flesh also fights obedience by appealing to self-preservation. It tells you to protect yourself at all costs. God's work teaches surrender, not self-destruction, but release of self-centered preservation. There is a difference between wisdom and self-protection. Wisdom obeys God, even when vulnerable. Self-protection avoids obedience to maintain control. This distinction is subtle but critical. Many believers believe they are being wise when they are actually being controlled by fear. The flesh cloaks avoidance in logic. God's call often feels illogical to the flesh because it operates on trust rather than calculation. Another way the flesh resists costly obedience is through resentment. When obedience leads to difficulty, the flesh becomes bitter. It asks why others seem to prosper while you struggle. It compares sacrifices. It questions fairness. This resentment poisons joy and weakens perseverance. God's work invites believers to trust His timing and justice. The flesh wants immediate balance. It wants sacrifices to be immediately compensated. God works with eternal perspective. This requires patience that the flesh does not possess. Obedience also exposes attachments. God often reveals what the flesh depends on by asking for it. When God asks for something, it is rarely because He wants to take it, but because He wants to reveal its hold on you. The flesh reacts strongly when attachments are threatened. These attachments may be relationships, ambitions, habits, or identities. Letting go feels like death because the flesh has built itself around them. God does not remove attachments to harm you. He removes them to free you from dependence on what cannot sustain you. This process feels painful because identity is shifting. The flesh loses familiar reference points. God establishes new ones. This transition is disorienting but necessary. Without it, obedience remains surface level. As obedience deepens, God also begins refining motives. He exposes why you obey, not just whether you obey. The flesh resists this refinement because it wants credit, it wants recognition. God's work purifies obedience so it flows from love rather than reward. This purification often leads to obscurity. God removes platforms that feed ego. He hides work that once felt visible. The flesh hates obscurity because it equates visibility with value. God values faithfulness unseen. Obscurity strengthens obedience because it removes secondary motivations. When no one is watching, obedience reveals allegiance. The flesh resists this stage intensely. Many believers quit here, mistaking obscurity for irrelevance. God's work also challenges the flesh by sustaining obedience over time. Initial obedience may feel energizing. Long-term obedience requires endurance. The flesh thrives on novelty. God forms character through consistency. Daily obedience weakens the flesh because it removes emotional drama. It becomes routine. The flesh cannot thrive without extremes. Quiet faithfulness starves it. This is why God emphasizes perseverance. Perseverance is obedience that continues when motivation fades. The flesh cannot endure perseverance. It seeks escape. The inner battlefield reaches a critical stage when obedience becomes identity rather than effort. When obedience flows naturally from alignment rather than force, the flesh has lost dominance. This does not mean temptation disappears, but it no longer defines direction. God's work is not to eliminate struggle, but to establish leadership. When the Spirit leads, obedience follows even when costly. When the flesh leads, compromise feels reasonable. Understanding this prepares believers for the final stages of transformation. Costly obedience is not punishment. It is proof that God trusts you with more. Responsibility increases as freedom grows. If this message is resonating with you and you want to continue understanding how God completes His work in the midst of this inner battle, subscribe to the channel now. What God is forming in you is worth protecting, pursuing, and finishing. Stay connected and continue this journey of transformation. The final and most decisive phase of the inner battlefield is not when the flesh is loud, aggressive, or openly resisting God. It is when the flesh becomes quiet, subtle, and nearly invisible. This is the stage where many believers assume the battle is over, when in reality it has simply changed form. The flesh no longer fights through obvious temptation. It fights through comfort, complacency, and spiritual numbness. This is the most dangerous moment in the journey because the absence of conflict can be mistaken for victory. God's work in a believer is never completed through a single breakthrough. It unfolds through lifelong alignment. The flesh understands this and adapts accordingly. When it can no longer dominate through rebellion, it seeks to survive through neutrality. It convinces believers that they are far enough, that vigilance is no longer necessary, that passion can soften into routine without consequence. This quiet erosion is more effective than open resistance. One of the clearest signs that the flesh is attempting a final foothold is spiritual stagnation disguised as peace. True peace is active, rooted in trust and obedience. False peace is passive, rooted in avoidance and disengagement. The flesh promotes a version of peace that requires nothing, costs nothing, and produces nothing. God's peace, by contrast, coexists with movement, growth, and continued surrender. In this stage, prayer may continue, but urgency fades. Scripture may still be read, but hunger diminishes. Obedience remains, but without expectancy. The flesh is content with this state because it neutralizes momentum. God's work is slowed not through sin, but through settledness. This is why Scripture repeatedly warns against spiritual sleep, not just spiritual rebellion. The flesh thrives when vigilance weakens. It does not need to overthrow your faith if it can slowly dull it. It understands that what is not nurtured eventually weakens. God's work requires ongoing attentiveness. Relationship with God is not maintained by memory, but by presence. Yesterday's obedience does not sustain today's faith. This stage also reveals whether spiritual discipline has become relational or merely habitual. Habits without heart eventually become hollow. The flesh is comfortable with hollow practices. God desires living connection. When discipline loses intimacy, it becomes vulnerable to decay. God's work continues to call believers deeper even when life feels stable. This is often misunderstood. Many believers assume that stability means arrival. In reality, stability often marks preparation for greater responsibility. The flesh resists this because it prefers comfort over calling. When God begins inviting you beyond stability into deeper trust, the flesh reasserts itself quietly. It says things like, "Why disrupt what is working?" or "There is no need to press further," or "You have done enough." These thoughts sound reasonable, but they are rooted in fear of further surrender. God's invitations do not always come with urgency. Sometimes they come as gentle nudges. The flesh resists these even more effectively because they can be ignored without guilt. This is where discernment becomes essential. Not every quiet season is meant for rest. Some are meant for refinement. Another subtle way the flesh fights God's final stages of work is by redefining faithfulness as maintenance rather than growth. Maintenance preserves what exists. Growth requires risk. God's work does not aim to preserve the believer as they are, but to mature them continually. The flesh prefers preservation because it requires no courage. Courage in this stage looks different. It is not bold action, but quiet obedience when no pressure is applied. It is choosing faithfulness without external reinforcement. It is responding to God's whispers, not just His commands. The flesh resists whispers because they require sensitivity. God refines sensitivity in this stage. He sharpens discernment. He exposes subtle compromises that once went unnoticed. This refinement can feel uncomfortable because it reveals that growth is still necessary. The flesh resists this awareness. It prefers the illusion of completion. One of the most challenging aspects of this final phase is sustained surrender. Initial surrender is dramatic. Sustained surrender is daily. The flesh is not threatened by dramatic moments if they are followed by complacency. It is threatened by consistency. God's work ultimately produces a believer who does not merely resist sin, but who is oriented toward obedience instinctively. This does not mean temptation disappears. It means temptation no longer defines direction. The flesh loses authority when obedience becomes identity. At this point, the inner battlefield is no longer chaotic, it is ordered. Leadership is established. The spirit leads, the flesh responds. Resistance still exists, but it no longer controls movement. This is maturity. Maturity does not mean ease. It means clarity. The believer recognizes the flesh quickly and responds decisively. There is no prolonged negotiation. There is no internal debate about direction. Alignment becomes natural through repetition and trust. God's work also produces humility at this stage. There is no illusion of self-sufficiency. The believer understands that victory is sustained by grace, not effort. This humility protects against relapse. Pride invites the flesh back into leadership. The flesh waits patiently for pride. It re-enters quietly through self-confidence that forgets dependence. God counters this by continually reminding believers of their need for Him. This reminder is not humiliation, it is protection. As the journey concludes, one truth becomes clear. The inner battlefield is not meant to be escaped. It is meant to be stewarded. God does not remove the flesh entirely in this life. He teaches believers how to live under proper leadership. The Spirit leads, the flesh follows. This ordering brings freedom, not freedom from struggle, but freedom from confusion. The believer knows what voice to follow. This clarity brings peace even in difficulty. God's work in you is intentional, patient, and complete. He does not begin transformation to abandon it. Every stage of resistance served a purpose. Every battle strengthened discernment. Every surrender expanded capacity. The flesh fought because it was losing ground. God prevailed because he was always in control. If you have followed this message and recognize this inner battle in your own life, do not stop here. Subscribe to the channel now and stay connected. This journey is not about information, it is about formation. What God is doing in you deserves continued truth, clarity, and perseverance. Stay with this path and let the work he began be fully completed.